Hi, my name is Nick Falk, and I am the president of the Alexander Hamilton Society here at the George Washington University. We want to welcome everyone here today to our first in-person event in over a year and a half. The COVID-19 pandemic has been difficult for everyone, and so we're really optimistic about what this upcoming academic year is going to look like. Before we start, I'd like to go over some announcements. First and foremost, tonight we will be doing our best to guard against the spread of COVID-19. In order to do that, we make it mandatory that all of you keep your masks on throughout the event. And we will also be carefully monitoring attendance, so if you've not already signed in at the check-in desk outside, please do so after the event. I also want to announce that we will be hosting a reading series this semester, and it's going to be on the book, What Good is Grand Strategy by Dr. Hal Brands. So the first 25 signups who sign up for our reading series, they will be able to get a free copy of the book. So if you're interested in signing up, please visit our check-in desk outside after the event. Also, I would like to encourage you guys to apply for our executive board. We have 2 positions open, and you should see that in the email list that we'll be sending out. So if you're interested, please apply. Finally, tonight we will also be having a question and answer period from the audience, and this will be happening after our speaker's remarks. However, I know that we are also recording this event, so if you have a question, you should know that you are being recorded. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers tonight. We are very lucky to be able to host Dr. Toshi Yoshihara and Dr. Robert Sutter for a conversation about East Asian competition between the United States and China with a focus on maritime grand strategy. Dr. Toshi Yoshihara is a former professor of strategy at the U.S. Naval War College and is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He currently teaches a graduate course about sea power in the Indo-Pacific at Georgetown University. He is widely published, having written several books, including his latest called Red Star of the Pacific, China's Rise and Its Challenge to U.S. Maritime Strategy, which is a highly regarded text for the U.S. military. Dr. Yoshihara received his bachelor's from Georgetown, his master's from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and his PhD from Tufts University. Our other speaker and moderator for tonight is Dr. Robert Sutter, a professor of practice of international affairs at the Elliott School. In addition to his accomplished academic career as a China expert, Dr. Sutter has also spent over 30 years in public service. During that time, he served as a senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service. He has also served as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at the National Intelligence Council, the China Division Director at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Dr. Sutter received his PhD from Harvard. We are all very lucky to be able to hear from these 2 incredible speakers tonight, and so please give our speakers a big round of applause. Dr. Sutter, you can begin.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here in person. I'm very grateful for this opportunity and to be with my good friend to share our thoughts with you about the United States and China and the competition between these 2 countries. And I thought to get us started, I'd try to focus, position our discussion, which will heavily be on East Asia and the maritime disputes and the maritime power issues. I thought I'd try to frame the U.S.-China relationship for you in a broader way so that where this fits into that situation. Today, the United States faces 3 groups of challenges from China. These are very serious. U.S. officials view these often as existential threats. The first one is the security, and that's what we're going to focus on today, but we can broaden out and talk about other issues as well. And that focuses on East Asia, and it's basically, are we at a tipping point? Where the Chinese, from a security point of view, will be the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific region. And clearly the advances of Chinese military power and so forth are such that this is a lively discussion on this issue. This issue is very good in the sense that you can monitor it pretty well. It's a transparent issue, more or less. I mean, weapon systems are secret and so forth, but it's fairly transparent. The second set of issues is also transparent, but not so much. And this is economics. And in this one, what we find is that the Chinese are seen as carrying out a whole host of economic policies that basically take gross advantage of the open economic system that the United States and many other developed countries have. And this has been going on for a long time. And in the past, the United States didn't pay too much attention to this. But now the size of the Chinese economy is such that this is now a fundamental issue for the world economic order. And it's from the point of view of the norms of this system, this is egregiously out of line. It's a very state-directed economic approach, applying power of the state to the advantage of commercial enterprises in China. And so this is something that, and it's led to this. It's led to the development, to the wealth of China, and to the point that the development of China in high technology is now reaching a point that it threatens the U.S. leadership in high technology industries. And when you get to that stage, what does that mean? That means, well, that China will be the dominant power in these high technologies industries. So that's a real loss economically. It's also a loss strategically. You will not have the superior military if you don't have the superior high technology. This will make the United States military second to China. Now, I'm putting this in fairly graphic terms, but this is the kind of terms that you hear on Capitol Hill commonly. They understand this way, and I think it's correct, that this is what's at stake, that the United States technical leadership has implications both for economics and for security. And then the third big challenge area, this is less transparent. And it's how the Chinese authorities challenge the global governance, the whole aspect of global governance. And the Chinese carry out a whole series of programs designed to spread their influence and control. They apply leverage to ensure deference to their concerns more than any other country I know. This is an amazing thing to watch, how the Chinese, they use all sorts of things for leverage. And they demand that countries abide by their preferences, and if they don't, they're punished, and they know it. And so this is a very, and what do they want? Well, they're expanding at others' expense. They want to legitimate what they're doing in the East and South China Sea, for example. They want to legitimate their economic practices. They want these to be endorsed. They are endorsed by the UN General Secretary. This is an amazing accomplishment. And so they're trying to change these systems. They want you to endorse Putin's activities. So this is really they have a whole series of dangers for global governance that flow from the Chinese practices as well. So this is the situation we face. It's a little grim. I'm sorry to summarize it like this. I've just finished writing a book on it. I mean, it's all ready to be published now. And so about U.S.-China relations, and this sums it up. And the final point I would raise is just that, is the U.S. effective in dealing with this? And this is very uncertain. The U.S. government, the president, the administration, and the Congress, they understand. They're aware. And they've been taking steps, but they don't necessarily have an effective strategy. Will they come up with one to deal with this? They will try, but they're hampered. And one thing that hampers them is that over time, the Chinese authorities have managed to integrate themselves so closely with the business community in the United States and with just about every other ally and partner of the United States, that these communities, they don't want to follow this tough approach to China. This makes it extremely difficult to come up with an effective policy. This contingency in the United States is very important for the United States. And so policymakers have to take this into account. Now, how did this integration take place? The U.S. encouraged it. This was enmeshment. This was engagement. And the United States encouraged this. And the Chinese authorities are very good at using these kinds of connections in an open society to their benefit. And so that's where we are. So that's a little gloomy, but I think we need to be a little realistic in understanding the situation that we're dealing with today. So thank you for the opportunity to share this. And now keep in mind, we're focusing right now on the security aspects of things. And so please.
All right. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today to share the stage with Professor Sutter. First of all, I just wanted to say how lucky all of you are to have Professor Sutter as your mentor and as your professor. Back in 1997, I was a student of his at SAIS when he was working full time and teaching on China and U.S.-China relations at SAIS. I remember actually when I actually didn't tell Professor Sutter when we were chatting here on the side, but one of the things I remembered about my time, Bob, was I had submitted a paper to him, and it was a paper that described essentially Chinese perspectives, a kind of a realist perspective on world affairs based on Chinese sources. It was a time when sources were becoming available. In addition to giving me a good grade, thank you, thank you, Professor Sutter, was that he wrote down in the back page in the note, he said that, I really liked the paper and I passed it along to my colleagues. And that was probably one of the most encouraging notes that I've gotten from a professor, that he would deem it good enough to be read by his colleagues. And I have to say that that was one of the sort of stimuli, if you will, that got me to study China as my profession. So again, I just wanted to convey to you just how lucky you are to have him as your professor. What I'd like to do this evening, though, is actually add to the gloom, make it even grimmer, I suppose. And I want to talk about essentially China's naval modernization and its impact on regional affairs, particularly in terms of its relationship with Japan. Because I think this bilateral naval balance really reflects the broader trend lines that we're talking about. And I find that this is particularly timely given the recent news about AUKUS. So the trilateral security relationship between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, partly to do with a plan to develop nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. This is all part of a larger trend in the region, which is driven primarily by this radical shift in the military balance across the Indo-Pacific, primarily driven by China's rapid military modernization. And I agree with Bob that this element of the competition is in fact fairly transparent in the sense that we can count things, we can look at things, we can at least conjecture about the performance and the capabilities of these things. These are fairly visible, and what we're looking at are essentially incontrovertible evidence that China has fundamentally shifted the larger military balance, of which the naval balance is a part. So my opening remarks this evening will be based on my CSBA report that was published last year called Dragon Against the Sun, Chinese Views of Japanese Sea Power. What it does is it examines the Sino-Japanese naval balance, the underlying sources of that radical shift in the balance, and then the shift's implication for not only regional security, but for the U.S.-Japan alliance, which is really the cornerstone to regional security. And my hope is that the summary of this report will then open up a broader discussion about the U.S.-China competition writ large, to include the economic and the political dimensions of the competition, but also specifically about the broader military competition. The report, when it was published last year, attracted a lot of attention in Japan. I think what surprised me was that it surprised them just how much had changed in their own backyard. And so a major Japanese commercial press translated and published the report, published it in record time. They did it in 4 months, which is pretty incredible. If you're talking even about commercial presses, it just kind of demonstrated the sense of urgency that prevailed in Tokyo. The translator of the report is the former chief of the maritime staff, so the former head of the Japanese Navy, Admiral Tomohisa Takei. And so the report enjoyed quite a bit of support, and thanks to his translation, I think it lent a lot of credibility to the report as well. In any case, what I want to do is to give you some backdrop to the report. So I began to follow the military balance between China and Japan more than a decade ago, and I watched with growing alarm as the military balance continued to shift in China's favor, and over the past decade, at an accelerated pace. And what worried me then and what worried me most now is that key elements of the Chinese Navy have already caught up to the Japanese Maritime Service, and in some cases have well surpassed that of the Japanese Navy. And so I wrote the study to draw attention to the shift in the local balance, a balance that surprisingly has captured very little attention outside of Japan itself. So my argument is this: China's displacement of Japan as a leading sea power in the Western Pacific will introduce more instability to the region and further stress the US-Japan alliance. It will intensify the Sino-Japanese naval rivalry that has been going on for well over a decade, and it will convince Chinese statesmen and commanders to pursue an offensive strategy should deterrence fail. I come to these findings based on an extensive survey of the Chinese language literature, Chinese open sources essentially, which have until now been largely unexplored in the West. And so much of my talk today is actually to let these Chinese analysts speak for themselves, to see the world through these Chinese analysts. Now, why does this topic matter? Well, first of all, Japan is a critical stakeholder and a defender of the current maritime order. The Japanese Maritime Service helps to keep the peace. And it is the combined naval power of the United States and its allies in Asia that constitutes the overall strategic balance. So the report is in part a good reminder that when we're talking about the military balance, it's not an exclusively bilateral Sino-US military or naval balance. It is truly a multilateral balance. We can't understand the military balance in the region without assessing the military capabilities of America's many allies and friends in the region. And so Japan's relative decline at sea has implications for regional stability. Secondly, what we know from the past, from history, is that when big shifts in the local naval balance of power takes place, bad things typically happen. So if you go back to antiquity, to the Peloponnesian War more than 2,000 years ago, through the First Sino-Japanese War a century ago, the Russo-Japanese War a century ago, World War I and World War II, all of those regional and great power wars were in part linked to some kind of a significant shift in the naval balance of power. And so, therefore, it's not surprising that great powers and regional powers have paid special attention to even minor shifts in the naval balance of power. But I'm not predicting that there's going to be great power war in Asia. Rather, I think the analogy here is Britain's relative decline during the Cold War. It was a period when Britain had fallen behind the Soviet Union very rapidly through the 60s and 70s. The Soviets had outstripped the British, just as the Chinese Navy has been outstripping the Japanese one today. The concern then, in the 70s in particular, was that Britain could not cope with Soviet probes in Britain's backyard. And the danger was that if the United States were ever preoccupied someplace else, like in the Eastern Mediterranean, that Britain would not be able to push back against Soviet probes, much less ask the UK to push back, to hold its position, much less push back. And so I think this particular historical parallel is apt, and I'm happy to discuss more about this during the Q&A. Third and finally, the naval power shift is a symptom of a much more profound challenge to Japan and its closest ally, the United States. Beijing's ambitions to achieve a regional primacy suggest that an even stronger China, if unthwarted, will potentially unravel the long peace that Japan and the United States have presided over for decades. Now, while Tokyo and Washington are clearly committed to defending the current order, China's rise will demand ever greater allied resources and cooperation. And yet, if Japan, the most capable and critical frontline state in the Western Pacific, cannot keep up with China, then the prospects for allied success will darken. And that is why, in my view, why Japan's relative decline is so worrisome. Now, let me say a few words about the current trend lines in the Sino-Japanese naval balance. And again, it is a microcosm of a much broader shift in the military balance. And when I looked at the numbers, the shift was simply, in the scale of the shift, simply remarkable. So I examined a variety of metrics that I won't bore you with tonight, but if you think about the fleet size, if you think about total tonnage, average tonnage, and firepower, if you look at all across those indexes of naval power, China is in many ways overwhelming the Japanese side. So what I did was I used the so-called vertical launch system. They're basically launch tubes built inside of ships to launch a variety of missiles. The VLS as a proxy for firepower. And what's really interesting about this technology is that Japan was actually ahead of China in the early 2000s. In fact, China had none up to the early 2000s and only began to introduce small numbers of them. But China rapidly closed the gap in the mid-2000s and then passed Japan in 2017 for the first time. And in 2019, the Chinese Navy had 60% more in VLS launch tubes. And in 2020, the last time that I took a look at the estimates, the Chinese Navy had 75% more in VLS. Again, a proxy for firepower at sea. These statistics give you a sense of just how quickly things are changing. And it's changing at an even more accelerated rate. Let me now say a few things about Chinese perspectives on the naval maritime competition. So I'll be speaking now from the Chinese perspective based on my reading of Chinese sources. So there are 4 sources that I'll talk about tonight. The first source of the competition is simple geography, the maritime geography of the region. The so-called first island chain that runs through from Japan down through Taiwan to the Philippines is seen in many ways as a physical barrier to China's maritime ambitions. The problem, of course, from the Chinese perspective, is that Japan dominates the northern half of the first island chain. And so Japan's commanding position on the first island chain could potentially constrain China's long-term maritime ambitions. The second source of the competition is the US-Japan alliance itself. Chinese analysts recognize that it is the only strategic bloc that's powerful enough to balk and frustrate China's ambitions at sea. Now, some Chinese analysts think about this in some ways that are caricature of the alliance that it's worth talking about. Some see the United States using the alliance instrumentally to contain China, whereas Japan is using the alliance instrumentally to expand its influence both regionally and globally. The third source of the competition, according to Chinese analysts, is regional and extra-regional security issues. They see that Japan is promoting a like-minded coalition of maritime states to isolate China. Some see Japan using the disputes in the South China Sea to tie China's attention down in the south in order to divert its attention from its disputes Japan's disputes with China over the East China Sea over the Senkakus. They also see Japan's globalizing maritime posture as increasingly overlapping with those of China's maritime presence beyond the Western Pacific, particularly in the Indian Ocean. And Chinese analysts have talked about the potential of one side's ability to dominate those sea lanes, which would then confer strategic leverage of one over the other. And so what's really interesting from that segment of the literature is in some ways a very zero-sum mentality about the maritime domain. The fourth source, which is really a fascinating kind of perspective, a window into the Chinese discourse, is Chinese assessments of Japan's national character. Some argue that Japan's hostility towards China is deeply ingrained in its national DNA, that Japan was never historically part of China's tribute system, that Japan embraced the West in the 19th century and rejected Asia during the Meiji Restoration, and that Japanese strategists imbibed Western sea power thought, which is of course highly offensively oriented, and that this offensive mindset is deeply embedded in the Japanese national culture going back centuries. In fact, I quote a senior captain of the Naval Command College in China who described the Japanese as possessing expansionist genes, sort of like Clash of Civilization on steroids. I think if you add all of these sources of the competition, according to this literature, what's worrisome to me is that there's a real sense of inevitability about the rivalry. Now let me say a few words about the naval balance itself. Again, this is from the Chinese perspective, based on Chinese language sources. So a decade ago, it's really fascinating that Chinese analysts were generally in awe of the Japanese maritime service. They saw that Japan was expanding its naval capabilities while becoming increasingly global. They admired Japan's procurement and acquisition processes that kept the Japanese Navy at the cutting edge. But if you look at the literature over the past 3-5 years, not so much. China is, of course, clearly closing the gap very rapidly. It is no longer the weakling that it was 2 decades ago. In fact, some Chinese analysts argue that it's hard to compare China to even 10 years ago. They point to Japanese weaknesses. Particularly, they criticize the Japanese for becoming too dependent on the United States, that Japan's naval development has been shaped in a way to support narrow American interests. And in that sense, because of that imbalance in development, Japan never developed an independent capability to defend itself against a powerful state like China. They also point to Japan's growing vulnerabilities. To China's acquisitions of a whole family of long-range missiles that are able to outrange and overwhelm Japanese fleet defenses. In one article, I came across a passage in which the author described Japan's large surface combatants as superb targets for Chinese missiles. Even in areas where Japan holds a competitive edge, Chinese analysts begin to think that those competitive advantages are eroding. Japan's anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which is of course still fairly world-class, I would argue, is no longer seen as threatening as it was in the past. They say that the Cold War experience is really not a good analogy anymore, that Japan faces a fundamentally different situation in which it is geographically overstretched, and of course Chinese submarine forces have improved substantially. I've also documented some of the literature on scenarios for short, sharp wars. And what's fascinating about these scenarios, we don't need to lend too much credence to the scenarios themselves, but the assumptions underlying those scenarios are quite telling. They of course depict a scenario in which the Chinese side wins very quickly, but it's premised on Japan very quickly losing command of the air, which is a precondition for follow-on Chinese military operations. Another important theme to emerge from the scenario is that U.S. non-intervention is seen as an absolute critical component to Chinese operational success, and consistent with my reading of existing naval doctrine in China, naval engagements will be lethal, quick, and decisive, where large numbers of ships go to the bottom of the ocean, probably in a single afternoon. And that's not surprising, and that's where the technology essentially is taking us in terms of naval warfare. So what does this mean for the U.S.-Japan alliance? In the interest of time, I'm just going to say two aspects, and happy to take your questions about what this means in terms of strategy. The first is, I think, culture matters. Culture matters because I think we should be aware that the other side may not necessarily share our own sensibilities. And that what I've come across are assessments that are premised on race-based or ethno-nationalist-based judgments about what the other side might or might not do. And so I think understanding the lens through which Chinese decision makers view the world, I think, is the one large sort of insight that I got in reading the literature. The second point, and I'll conclude with the second point, is that the alliance matters. Chinese analysts have repeatedly argued in their assessments that the U.S.-Japan alliance is truly the only strategic bloc that stands in the way of China's ambitions. And so I think going forward in terms of the broader implications, of course, is to ensure that Beijing does not misread Allied resolve, even in the midst of this significantly deteriorating military balance. So with that, I will conclude my remarks, and I look forward to interacting with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Toshi. That was really a terrific presentation. We're supposed to now talk about different issues that emerge that are relevant to our broad topic. And so, Toshi, if you have follow-on comments you'd like to make, that'd be fine. Why don't I start off with just a question or two, and we can talk about those. the question I have is we read a lot about the Chinese commentary seeing the West in decline and the East rising. And the East doesn't include Japan in this regard. They're in the West from this category. And did that come up in your review of the military, of the dynamic that you were looking at in China-Japan relations? In other words, was it premise that we're in Beijing, that we're ascendant, and these powers are just in decline, including the United States, or especially the United States? And so, because that can lead to judgments about how resolved a country might be in dealing with power. What are your thoughts on that issue in your judgment?
Yeah, so I think, thank you for that question. I think it is a sort of a significant risk factor when we think about the larger military balance, which is really China's judgments about will and morale of its potential adversaries, whether it's the United States or Japan. And I think my concern is that because of a dramatic shift in the military balance of power that has given the Chinese military capabilities that it could only dream of even just a decade ago, might confer a kind of confidence that they might be able to achieve their aims, and that confidence will be spurred by this assessment that the West, Japan along with the West, are in decline, and that they no longer have either the capacity or the confidence to defend their own interests. And my concern is that historically what we've seen is a misreading or a misjudgment about adversary resolve. I think Imperial Japan's calculation concerning the United States prior to Pearl Harbor, I think is a good kind of cautionary tale. It's certainly a potential parallel in which Japanese decision makers assumed that the United States did not possess the will, was weak-kneed, and that if Japan could deliver that decisive blow, as it did through Pearl Harbor, that it would knock the United States off balance and provide the conditions for Japan to engage in negotiations in which the United States would acknowledge Japanese interests in the Pacific. And we saw how that backfires, right, because of that miscalculation about will. So I think there is a real danger that this narrative that they've crafted for themselves, they come to become true believers in that narrative about the West decline, and that could in turn influence their calculus of risk, their decision makers in times of crisis and so forth.
Excellent, thank you. If you have follow-on comments, I have a follow-on question that we can continue on the Japan side. Is your understanding the Biden administration is trying to put together a strategy to deal with the challenges China poses, and it relies on allies and partners. And as I indicated, the U.S. ability to do this is complicated by business interests and other interests in the United States that don't favor that kind of approach. Japan is a similar situation. They have a business community that also doesn't want to have this kind of tough policy toward China. And so how significant is that from the Japanese point of view? In other words, is Japan willing to line up with the United States in this tough approach toward China? They seem to be, but they also might be reluctant to do tough things on the economic side. So what's your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't follow closely Japanese domestic politics, but I do agree with you that there are clearly domestic constituents in Japan, as they are here, that would resist any sort of hard line that would disrupt their economic and financial interests in China. But I think what is interesting is that partly because of China's growth and of course China's behavior in recent years, both within the region and abroad, there has been, I think, a palpable shift in attitudes about sort of what's permissible as a part of the political discourse. So we have a for example, a few days, maybe it was yesterday, one of the candidates running for the premiership in Japan, she is being, Takaichi is being supported by the former Prime Minister Abe. She has been very, very hawkish on China, has spoken about things that probably would have sunk previous candidates. So it's become acceptable to be very hawkish, including I think yesterday she had a virtual chat with President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan. Imagine that. So I think the discourse is in fact changing, and that things that were unthinkable in the past politically have become increasingly thinkable, due in no small part to China's own actions.
You're an old, you're experienced military observer and analyst working with the U.S. government, and you well know that the U.S. government has always felt that the focal point of China's military modernization was a Taiwan contingency. And Japan's role in this, if you go back over 20, 25 years, has always been vague, not very clear. And Japan speaking about this issue authoritatively and was, with at least the people in power, rarely did this sort of thing. And yet we see a change in Japan, as you just indicated, this candidate talking to the Taiwan president. And yet this is a dangerous business. If you're looking at Taiwan and you're talking about the military balance changing, I mean, the place that's really affected by this is Taiwan, because they're the first target of the PRC, it seems to me. And so what is Japan's approach to Taiwan? Because they've actually been a lot more forthright in their rhetoric about Taiwan, and something that we hadn't seen before. And of course, the U.S. government under the Trump administration and endorsed by the Biden administration, in their rhetoric has just been very different from what they were in the previous governments. So we seem to have the imbalance militarily, perhaps, or tipping toward China militarily, and yet the U.S. and Japan both are providing more political support to Taiwan. So how do you read this situation?
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of evidence, again, within the Japanese political class of a greater willingness to be forthright about Taiwan and its strategic and security importance to Japan. And I think I would just lay this out from a purely sort of simple geographical calculation. I think it's important to note that I would argue that Japan's security is basically inseparable from that of Taiwan, just by the dint of geography. So if you follow the line of islands that run through Japan, from the main islands, from Hokkaido through Honshu, through Kyushu, and then the string of small islands that connect, basically, or that link the southern home island of Kyushu and Taiwan, are what the Japanese call Southwest Islands. And the most southern tip of essentially Japanese administered territory is only like 110 kilometers from the northeast coast of Taiwan, which means that in any major military contingency or even a cross-strait war, it's hard to conceive of any scenario in which Japanese security would not be affected. In fact, in a wartime scenario, it's hard to imagine how Japanese sovereignty over its airspace and space would not be violated by the People's Liberation Army, by the Chinese military. So I think just by the dint of geography, it's very, very difficult to disentangle what happens in a cross-strait scenario from Japan's security. I think another interesting sort of perspective is that from Japan's perspective, Taiwan has always been in sort of friendly hands, if you will, right? So it was literally in friendly hands when, of course, Taiwan was a colony of Japan. When the nationalists arrived on Taiwan, we had an anti-communist regime on the island. And then, of course, in the 1990s, we had a democratization of Taiwan, meaning that Japan has a vested interest in maintaining ties with a democratic partner, which also has always been a close economic partner. And so for all of those reasons, any shift in Taiwan's status, whether Taiwan joins China peacefully or whether Taiwan falls to China militarily, it would represent a fundamental shift in the geopolitical picture for Japan that has been sort of, that would transform Japan's story. That's basically unprecedented since 120 years ago. And I think, given the shift in the military balance, I think Japanese strategists and politicians are coming to recognize that the idea that its neighborhood could change radically is no longer so unthinkable, and that in part I think animates the shift in the debate about Taiwan. And I think one of the really interesting aspects of this is the political framework for Japan to have a relationship with Taiwan has not caught up to those strategic realities. So there's been an ongoing debate for years now in Japan about coming up with its own Taiwan Relations Act that would provide the political basis for closer political, economic, diplomatic, and perhaps indirectly military ties. Japan needs a real framework to have a relationship with Taiwan in a real meaningful sense, and that remains to be seen.
I think what I'd like to do now is just broaden out the scope a bit. And one of the questions that we're asked to address has to do with China's geopolitical position and military strategy. And what I'd like to do is look at that in the context of what is known as the Quad. This is the relationship the U.S. has with Japan, India, and Australia. It's a nascent type of alignment, and the focus is on China, dealing with China. So if you look at the map, you see these Japan and India are the two of the four big powers in Asia. Russia and China are the other two. And so this is, so you got these two sort of siding with the United States and from a strategic point of view, dealing with China. And India is moved in this direction from its usually more neutral position, at least ostensibly, because of the pressures it's been under about China over the last couple of years. And so India and Australia's made its position quite clear over the last week or so, and now Japan, working with the United States. And so how does this, I wonder how, and my sense is that this is an advantage for the United States in dealing with China. China doesn't have allies. China is powerful, but it doesn't have allies. And its geopolitical, its position geographically is just vulnerable, because they're surrounded by all sorts of difficulties. And so it's getting better perhaps, but how they will dominate this area is hard to imagine thus far. And so when I look at the situation myself, and Toshi, I'd like to get your views on this as well, I say, okay, well, this is a real source of advantage for the United States. You have the military balance that was just talked about. You didn't really get into the U.S. Japan balance vis-a-vis China, but it's, as you say, it's changing in China's favor. But these other alignments, adding to the possibility of other difficulties for China, seem to be quite significant. When I look at where China is gaining around its region, and I think my premise is, if China is going to be the dominant power of Asia, they have to control the rim of China, and they don't control the rim, and so it's going to take a while to do that, it seems, and so this is elsewhere. The China in Central Asia, they're doing well. They have great relations with Russia to the north, but then when you get further south in Southeast Asia, they're making advances there. In the South China Sea, they're making advances there. And the countries are deferring to China outwardly. But a lot of them don't like it, but they're not prepared to really stand up to China because China will punish them, and they know that. And so they don't do that. And so when the vice president goes to Vietnam, the U.S. vice president goes to Vietnam, she is upstaged by the Chinese ambassador offering vaccines to the Vietnamese people. And the Vietnamese government allows that to happen. So it's suggesting that China gets top billing in Hanoi. So this is an advance from the, but it's a small step, whereas the Quad seems quite serious for the Chinese, and how they would deal with that is would spread their assets, and they're a single actor. So this is I mean, we're in a very fluid situation. We really don't know. But I'm still struck by, I think the balance and the order in Asia is still very much in play, and that China's rise is evident, no question about that. But dominance, when will dominance happen? I just don't, I don't see that right now. But Toshi, please.
Yeah, so I do see China's fundamental geographic position as a long-term vulnerability. I think you're absolutely right. And Chinese strategists talk about China as a composite or hybrid land-sea power, meaning that it is a classic power that faces continental commitments with 14 countries that it shares land borders with, then maritime commitments, it faces the first island chain, right? A transnational archipelago with very powerful countries like Japan. I would count, by the way, South Korea as a half island. It's part of the island chain. A grouping of powerful maritime states that lies just offshore of China, that also don't particularly have not had great historical relations, but also distrust China to a certain extent, and many of them are formal allies of the United States, right? Chinese strategists have been surprisingly introspective in this regard, which is that they openly acknowledge that the historical track record of hybrid land-sea powers has not been great, right? If you look at past aspiring great powers, Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, just to name a few, over the past 2 centuries, all of these aspiring great powers that wanted to also acquire sea power were all hybrid land-sea powers like China. And what was their downfall, particularly in wartime? Overextension. That the reigning maritime power of their respective periods were able to harness their coalitions in a way, both with maritime powers as well as continental powers, to both squeeze, surround, and isolate a hybrid land-sea power. So I think Chinese strategists are deeply aware, and this debate has been going on for more than 20 years. This phrase, composite land-sea power, has been around for over 20 years. They are acutely sensitive and acutely aware of this potential vulnerability of being overextended, of being surrounded, and of being isolated. And I think this is, in fact, an important asymmetric advantage on the part of the United States. The United States not only enjoys a series of bilateral treaty alliances, the so-called hub and spoke arrangement, or the so-called San Francisco system, but what we're seeing with the Quad, with AUKUS, is really a proliferation of different types of informal coalitions, an overlapping network of relationships in which each side, of course, pursuing their own national interests, but finding areas of shared interest to collaborate. What we're also finding, I think is an interesting trend, is a trend in which the United States is actually not directly involved in those relationships. So the frontline states are developing their own relationships with fellow frontline states. So Japan is actively engaged in so-called capacity building with countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, and India, selling different capabilities and so forth. Japan now has a very close security relationship with Australia. In fact, second only in closeness and importance to the U.S.-Japan alliance. So I think what we're seeing really is this kind of overlapping set of informal and formal relationships that I think together and over time could really sort of counterbalance China's rise. So I think we do have to think in terms of coalitions, in terms of sort of this long-term evolution of the region. And then there's another part of the overextension piece, which is and effort to cultivate relations with India. Because I think, one of the insights when you think about the dilemmas of a hybrid land sea power is that it is fundamentally about opportunity costs. In other words, every yuan that China spends in the continental direction is one fewer yuan that it can spend in the maritime and aerospace direction, and vice versa. And so again, to the extent that worsening relations between China and India, that's of course evolved on their own, could kind of impose those kinds of opportunity costs. Those are certainly things that we need to be paying attention to. But the key question to me is, has China grown so powerful and gotten so rich that whatever problems that India could pose on a continental front would be really a marginal cost, right? It's not a substantial cost. It's not like when we opened up to China during the Cold War and China became a quasi-ally of ours that really put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. So again, the question is thinking about those parallels and identifying differences between those parallels, I think, are just as important. And I think, again, the key question is, has China gotten to a point, to go back to Professor Sutter's point about tipping point, has it gotten to such a point that no amount of effort that India could put up on the Himalayan border could divert substantial or significant resources away from China's larger projects in the maritime domain?
Well, one of the questions, maybe to conclude our part here, one of the questions that we were asked to address is the antagonism and potential cooperation between the United States and China. We started this session and continue to be pretty gloomy about that. So maybe we should have a little discussion about what we think about the potential for cooperation between the U.S. and China. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess I have a kind of a different take on this, which is that I think we, the typical candidates that we hold up as areas for cooperation, and you hear this from administration officials, from administration to administration. It's kind of the same list, right? It's shared value, shared interests over things like the environment, shared interest over non-proliferation, shared interest over terrorism, and so forth. And I agree that those are areas for potential cooperation. But I guess I kind of conceive of cooperation differently, which is that we are cooperating every day on a variety of issues. The enmeshment that you described means that we've been tied up together in a variety of activities, economic, financial, and otherwise. In fact, we have so many points of contact that it'll probably be quite difficult to kind of do a balance sheet, like a net assessment of where those ties and those cooperative efforts are ongoing. So I would say that we are cooperating on an inordinate number of things that in some ways we take for granted, because of the degree to which we've been enmeshed. I think the question is, and it's a question that has been sort of been brought up since the Trump administration to today. I think it's continued, which is determining what elements of that cooperative relationship do we sort of turn off or disengage. Now, on the one hand, China has already sort of decoupled or disengaged, if you will, based on their own ambitions to achieve strategic self-sufficiency on a variety of technologies and capabilities that Xi Jinping and the regime sees vital to China's long-term competitiveness. So that's in some ways happening on its own. But on our side, I think we still have some questions to answer that, in terms of recapturing leverage, if you will, of determining what elements of that cooperative relationship needs to be sort of dialed back or even turned off. And I think that's where we are in the relationship.
It's very interesting. My personal view on this is that I did a briefing for the embassy in Beijing. I guess it was in 2016, and we brought together the whole team, the country team, so representatives of different components. and there were about 30 people in the group, and none of them worked on U.S.-China relations. They all worked on segments of cooperation with China. You know, so somebody from science and technology, somebody from education, somebody from health, you know, and this kind of thing. And I thought most of these things atrophied under the Trump government. In other words, that they just stopped them. And the difficulty we had with the finding out what was happening in Wuhan was because we had lost these contacts with our Chinese counterparts that had been established over the years. So I didn't think we had all that much official interaction. We have a lot of interaction, but the official interaction I thought had been cut back a lot. And maybe the Biden people have revived a lot of it. I'm not sure. I haven't investigated that. But my sense is, and if I look at the rhetoric I look at the actions of the Congress, I look at the actions of the Biden administration, I think we're in for a period of struggle. I think this is we're going to test each other. We're going to see who can last, who will. I mean, it's almost like when I was 13 and you had a sandlot fight with somebody. Who's going to last? And that's the way we seem to be at this point. And I see the determination and they're passing all this legislation and the Biden people are just they're talking very tough on all sorts of issues and springing surprises. I mean, this agreement with Australia came out as a big surprise to the Chinese, and it's not a happy one. So this is the kind of game we're playing, it seems to me, at this point, and to see which one will give in, which one will, and I think that's going to take a long time. I don't think that's going to go easy. I don't think Xi Jinping's going to change, and I don't think the U.S. is going to change very much. I think it's. I'm struck by the bipartisanship of this in the Congress, and so I think that's likely to continue.
Yeah, if I could add one final note on that point. Yeah, I mean, I do think about the competition in terms of a long-term peacetime competition. As you described it, kind of a long struggle. And so I think when you stretch the timeline out, the power curve, if you will, between China and the United States, are likely to fluctuate over time. So what China will look like in the 2030s is probably very different from what China is today. And what the United States will look like 10, 15 years from now is very different. So I think part of our job is to kind of understand the long-term dynamics where America's competitive position might actually look much better than, say, today. But I think a lot of those shifts in the competitive dynamics and the competitive positioning will depend on critical decisions being made today. So I think while the AUKUS agreement that we've been hearing about with Australia has typically focused on the nuclear-powered submarine, that's grabbed most of the headlines, I think it's the technological components of the competition that are likely to be more important from that agreement, where the three sides have agreed to engage in cooperation in areas like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and cyber. It's about competing at the leading edge in these areas that will give significant leverage to the side that dominates in those fields. And again, that's a kind of a long-term evolution, a long-term competition in which the fruits of those investments are not going to be clear until, say, the 2030s.
Great. Well, I think it's time for Nicholas to take over.
All right, we are now going to be transitioning to our question and answer period from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We ask that you please stand up and introduce yourself, and that you also keep your questions brief and on topic so that we can get as many questions as possible. John here will be handing a microphone to you as well. So yes, right in the front.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Paul Leone. I'm a freshman at the Elliott School. Thank you so much for coming tonight to speak with us and give us so much insight on this extremely dynamic issue. My main question is going off of the context of Professor Potter's last remarks about how we have this new sense of a long-term competition struggle, power struggle between Chinese powers and the United States in almost paralleling a type of Cold War. But my question is, specifically with the Taiwan issue, with China being increasingly aggressive militarily towards Taiwan, for instance, with their recent Air Force activity breaching Taiwanese airspace, how inevitable is a fast-paced cross-straits war or a fast-paced military conflict specifically regarding Taiwan in the context of this long Cold War type struggle of power?
Sure, that's a great question. So I do think that the military balance has deteriorated significantly across the strait. And I think one way of thinking about this problem is sort of, what are China's options vis-a-vis Taiwan should deterrence fail? There are, I would put them in sort of three big buckets of areas. The first is some kind of a blockade, an economic blockade that's designed to kind of starve out the island. The second bucket of activities could be sort of a very missile-centered approach where China basically pursues a strategy of punishment by employing its vast firepower to attack Taiwanese air bases, Taiwan's political military centers, and so forth, and that the pain that results from that would be sufficient for Taiwan to say negotiate on terms favorable to China. And then the third bucket would be the kind of the full-scale invasion, the kind of the Normandy-style invasion. Although it's not likely to look anything like a Normandy-style invasion. We've now seen really interesting works about how the PLA might use civilian transports to ferry troops across the strait. But nevertheless, I think those are the three ways of thinking about the threat that China poses to Taiwan. So the flip side of that is what can we do to uphold deterrence, which is to partly to deny China the ability to deliver a fait accompli. I think that's the strategy that we're most concerned about, right? Which is that China makes a very rapid, it's a sort of the first mover advantage, takes the first move, and sort of resolves the crisis or conflict so quickly that the United States does not have time to respond, especially given the fact that the United States, being a distant power, has to mobilize a lot of resources to send reinforcements across the Pacific. And so there is this window in which China might be able to pull off such a fait accompli. So the question before US and allied defense planners is, what do we do to prevent that fait accompli from happening? And I think we are beginning to see developments, investments on the part of the US military and on the part of US allies that's designed specifically to deny those immediate operational objectives. And it requires, in some ways, the US military to fundamentally change the way it operates in the region and revisit assumptions about how it can project power into the theater. So I think one of the enduring pillars of American forward strategy in the region is it's aircraft carrier, right? It's the ultimate token of American commitment and credibility to its allies and friends. And yet that is the very system that has become increasingly vulnerable to China's weapon system, what American strategists call a wasting asset. It's become less and less usable in wartime, even though it's perfectly great for sort of peacetime shows of force. And so that requires the US military to fundamentally undergo a shift in mindset about what different types of capabilities, what new kinds of capabilities will be needed to impose costs on a PLA campaign that would deny them that ability to present a fait accompli. And so I've argued that basically the United States and its allies need to increasingly sort of tear a page from the Chinese playbook and adopt its own sort of anti-access area denial capabilities that's designed to sort of impose big cost on PLA military operations inside the First Island chain. And this actually takes advantage of the US and allied position as the exterior offshore power. The side that has the most to lose from an anti-access kind of a scenario is China. China finds itself as an interior power closed off behind that first island chain. So the United States and its allies can really take advantage of that geographical position to impose those kinds of costs. And I think, again, time is of the essence. We really need to get this right to sort of restore deterrence in the Taiwan Strait.
Thank you so much.
Professor Sutter, do you have any comments, or should we move to the next question?
Well, I think we have a lot of questions there,
Yeah.
and so.
Okay. All the way in the back. Yes, you.
Hi, my name is Joshua Leary. I'm also a freshman in the Elliott School, and my question is specifically about. I was wondering how the both of you think that Japan's current demographic difficulties will be impacting its long-term strategic relationship vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, so I've actually dabbled a little bit into, Japan's demographic problem. It is on the leading edge in terms of demographic decline because of historically low birth rates, and the growing longevity of the aged. What we're seeing is the demographic pyramid becoming inverted. So there's an ever larger proportion of the aged in which the working demographic need to support, and there are ever fewer, younger people to replace the working age population. Japan is really, it is at the leading edge of being a graying power, and so that has implications, for example, on recruiting. How do you recruit enough manpower to join, Japan's defense forces? It has long-term implications on Japan's economic productivity as the workforce continues to shrink. Just to give you a sense of how quickly this is, how dramatic the shift will take place. Japan peaked at around 128 million about 5-6 years ago. It's projected that it's going to go, I think, below 100 million by mid-century. And so it is a dramatic shift in population decline. Now, what's interesting to know, okay, so there's another point, which is that the question for the United States in terms of its grand strategy, in terms of relying on these pillars of these allies is, the question is, what are the consequences when one of the key pillars of your security architecture is aging and shrinking over time, right? And I think, that leads to interesting questions about, again, realignment, looking for other partners. I think, India is one of those kind of exceptional cases where it's not going to run into that kind of demographic problem over the long term. There's another point that's important to know. So China, too, is undergoing a dramatic, possibly an even more dramatic downturn in its demographic profile. And as you've all probably heard, China, unlike Japan, risks getting old before it gets rich, meaning that it won't have the luxury of having the social welfare network net to protect the aging population. The working age population is shrinking very rapidly as it is, and so China will also face its own demographic challenges over the long term. So as I said, when we're thinking about the long-term competition, one of the areas that we need to observe is the impact of demographics on China's position. What will China's demographic profile look like in the 2030s, and what will that do to China's competitive position? I think those are kind of the longer-term questions that we ought to be asking and keeping track of.
Great.
All right, next question. Yes, on the right. Yes.
So hi, I'm Zach. I'm also a freshman in Elliott School, and I'm actually from Beijing. So one of the things that I actually ran into back when I was interning in a think tank back home is the idea called crisis management between U.S. and China naval competition. So I guess my question is, does this crisis management mechanism exist right now? And if yes, then how do we maintain this strategic trust between the two powers so that there isn't any kind of crisis that leads into an accident, that leads to escalation, and so forth? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's always important to have mechanisms to ensure crisis stability. Right now, I would say that we have some rudimentary lines of communications and mechanisms to deal with unforeseen crises. But what we have found in the past is that even when those crises take place, and even when there's a good reason to pick up the phone and begin communicating, we find that the other side's not willing to pick up the phone. And so part of this is the political will to engage in the actual management of the crisis. But I do want to throw out something that's perhaps controversial, which is that I think there's a tendency to overinflate this idea of miscalculation or mistakes. I find that my reading of great power interactions is that great powers typically don't stumble into war because of miscalculation and mistakes. It's that there's an underlying will to want to escalate and to go to war, and that the crisis or the miscalculation is simply the kind of the match that lights the fuse. So I'm not entirely convinced that that we should be too overly focused on this idea of avoiding accidents at all costs as somehow a cure-all for, I think, the broader strategic imbalance that's taking place in the region.
All right, if Dr. Sutter doesn't have any comments, we can go to the next question. Yes, in the middle of the back.
Hi, my name is Eva Chong. I am a freshman in the School of Business. In the event that deterrence strategies do not work and there is a violent or somewhat peaceful takeover of Taiwan into China, as in the One China policy, what do you think the U.S. and Japan would react to that in both scenarios?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't actually.
You didn't hear the question? Could we run the mic up to her?
No, it's fine. Just the last part.
Oh, could you please repeat your last part?
So if it's a violent takeover of Taiwan, how would U.S. and Japan react to that? Or I should say, how far would they go to defend Taiwan?
How far would the U.S. go to defend Taiwan and China? Is the attack underway? I don't quite understand. Has the attack already taken place and been successful?
No. If deterrence strategies fail,
Right.
and there is such an interaction, I just want to ask, would U.S. actively defend Taiwan?
Well, this is all very situation dependent.
Yes.
It's a very dangerous thing to have a war with China. So this is something that I'm sure the policymakers would avoid if at all possible. But defending Taiwan is more likely today than just about any other time I can think of. And I've been watching this issue for 60 years. The U.S. support for Taiwan today is remarkably strong. And so if Beijing attacks today, I would say that we now have a majority of American public think that we should defend Taiwan. That has not happened in 40 years. So this is an amazing change in the United States and how they think about this. And my sense is this is part of a broader trend that there's the United States recalibrating the whole approach to China. And this is leads to the stakes are high everywhere, it seems, and so the stakes would be seen as high here, and that could push you into a war.
Thank you.
So I think it depends on sort of the context of how the conflict actually breaks out. And I think one of the key questions about the Taiwan scenario is, what do Chinese decision makers think about Japan's position in all of this? Because I think this is really kind of a really interesting question, right? So because of the fact that the United States forward presence is predominantly concentrated in Japan, and the reality is, should a crisis or a war break out, U.S. forces based in Japan will be the ones that will be the first responders to the crisis or the war over Taiwan. So I think Chinese decision makers face a really kind of an interesting decision, which is, does the PLA incorporate attacks on U.S. bases in Japan as a part of its first move against Taiwan? Now, that choice is operationally efficacious, but strategically counterproductive, right? Because it's hard to imagine that strikes on the Japanese territory, even if it's not Japanese bases, would not draw in Japan into the conflict. Which means, of course, it would mean a horizontal escalation of the conflict in which you're virtually guaranteeing the third largest economy in the world joining the largest economy in the world in this fight over Taiwan. So it makes sense operationally to attack Japan in that sense, but strategically speaking, it doesn't make that much sense. It's kind of like Germany's option in World War I, right? Do you run over neutral Belgium to get to France, right? Operationally, that looks great. It's the most direct route. It gets you to France very quickly. But you're virtually guaranteeing British involvement because it's a violation of the neutrality of the Low Countries, right? So it's a very similar debate. So the question is, how do Chinese decision makers think about this question of horizontal escalation? And it could have a huge impact based on that decision. It could have a huge impact on how that conflict actually evolves. And I guess my sense is, well, it depends on Chinese calculation of where Japan stands, right? If Beijing thinks that Japan is going to be all in no matter what, then it doesn't matter whether China doesn't act or act, right? It might as well act militarily against Japan. But if it thinks that there is some way to drive a wedge that could keep Japan on the sidelines, then it might try a different method that won't automatically draw in Japan on the first day of that conflict. So I think it's a really interesting sort of, in some ways, a kind of a theoretical debate about sort of, what's the cost and benefit analysis in dealing with a critical allied country that could be drawn into that particular conflict.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next question. By the way, we are running out of time, so we can try to keep the questions brief, please. Maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, in the back in the white shirt.
So I'm Aiden. I'm from the school I'm a junior, and I know that the Article 9 of Japan orbit Japan will have a full-scale military. So do you think that eventually Japan will revoke the Article 9 of the Constitution? And how will the Korean Peninsula and Russia respond to that change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not a scholar of the Japanese Constitution, but I think my understanding right now is the political debate is less about revoking Article 9, but introducing amendments to the Constitution that allows for greater freedom of action. And the reality is, Japanese politicians have found workarounds, right, with the existing constitutional restrictions to do all sorts of things, and so the question is, to what extent will the amendments to the Constitution open up more options for Japan to cooperate and collaborate with its allies? I don't find it convincing that Japan would suddenly have a kind of a nuclear breakout or a military breakout, just because it made changes to the constitutional order. I think the norms are fairly sticky, And so, I think the more sort of interesting question is, what kinds of room will Japanese decision maker find in the aftermath of that kind of an amendment?
All right. Yes, right here in the front.
Hi, my name's David. I'm a freshman in the LA School of International Affairs. My question for you guys are, how are U.S. allies dealing with rising U.S. nationalism in regards to their interventionism policy, and how much they can depend on the U.S. as an ally in the South China Sea?
Yeah, I think the Allies have a lot of problems with the United States. The U.S. approach to China, the U.S. is actually more tough toward China than just about any of the Allies. And so the Biden administration, in its efforts to build a coalition of allies and partners, has to some degree, water down some of the firmness that they want to see on the coalition in dealing with China, because the allies are not at the same level in seeing the China danger and the sense of urgency about the need to counter the various challenges coming from China. In addition, these allies and partners have these domestic forces, as I talked about in the United States, which are very integrated with China and don't want to have these kind of difficulties with China. My sense is that this administration, nonetheless, wants to move forward with allies and partners as much as possible, and work with them closely in dealing with China. And obviously the Quad and the agreement with Australia and I think Australia is on the same level with the United States in how they look at China, but most aren't at that level. Even Japan, I don't think Japan is at that level. They're not prepared to confront China in this direct way. And so I think that's a dilemma that the United States faces, but I don't think it's a serious one. And I think that because the trend is moving ever more toward allies feeling the pressure from China and seeing the urgency of dealing with this situation, the Chinese government is behaving badly toward these countries. And so they have this, they're reacting to this sort of thing, and I think that accentuates, it makes it easier for the United States to have common interests with these different countries.
Yeah, I think Australia is a really interesting case, especially when it comes to Chinese political influence, which is that, the Australians in some ways have been on the front lines of Chinese influence operations. And Australia has gone to great lengths, taking quite a bit of political costs, passing anti-interference legislation, making a very costly decision to not rely on China for its 5G network. I mean, a lot of really difficult and costly decisions. And I think, in some of these cases, it's, I think the United States has a lot to learn from how the frontline states have responded to Chinese behavior.
All right, I think we can have time for 2 more questions, but speakers, if we can please keep the answers brief, and questions, please be brief, and we can do 2 more. Yes?
So I'm Jerry, and I'm a freshman at the LA School. So my question was simply, how do you see the China's Belt and Road Initiative? Do you see it as offensive policy or defensive?
I guess I have, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is very complicated, and it poses a lot of challenges for the United States. The commercial aspects of it show that the Chinese win these contracts, and so they have economic benefits. But there are many other dimensions of this that are very, very negative. And it gets to the governance issue that I was talking about, the challenges China poses with governance. Because these deals are done in ways that are often corrupt. They're done in ways that enable authoritarian regimes. They're done in ways that take advantage of the international financial institutions that make these governments solvent for a while. China comes in and makes a bunch of deals with them, and then they're not solvent anymore. They take advantage of that. And so you have a whole series of these, and then the Chinese control efforts in these countries. They build infrastructure Infrastructure is used for control, it's for leverage. So when you get a Huawei communications mechanism, you're not going to be able to change it because you're going to need the Chinese to fix it if it goes wrong. So these things are big, and a hydroelectric dam is the same thing, a railroad, and big road, airport. All of these things will require these countries to defer to China on a variety of issues. And we've seen how the Chinese can get very upset about things that seem not that big a deal, and they go around the world saying you have to do what we want. And these countries have to do it because they're dependent on China. They're dependent for all this infrastructure. So it's the whole series of issues that change the way governance works. And it's moving in a direction that's not in the interest of countries that want accountability by the government. It's not accountable. And so in many cases, in most cases. And so those are, I wish I had some good news about the BRI, but those are the dimensions that the U.S. sees as a real problem with the BRI.
Yeah, if I could take a slightly more sort of military slant, which is I think the BRI and all of the China's relationships and investments around the world is potentially creating sort of an alternative model for China's globalizing military presence. So it's going to follow its own way in developing its ability to access facilities. It's going to be very different from the way the United States conceived of its forward presence. Concentration of massive military bases on allied soil and so forth. I think what we'll see is a kind of a very different approach to how China will be able to extend its influence. That will be a kind of a hybrid model that'll involve financial, economic incentives that perhaps opens doors to initial, temporary access to Chinese military forces in different parts of the world. And so I think, trying to discern what that model is and how different it's going to look like is going to be, to me, I think, one of the challenges for U.S. decision makers, which is to kind of, to be able to imagine a world sort of outside of the one that they're used to. Think about how the other side might approach this issue of having a global presence through a very different approach.
All right, we have time for one more question. Yes, right here on the left. You.
Good evening. My name is Jacob Dirks, and I'm a freshman in the LA School. My question is pretty brief. How significant do you think the construction of the Chinese military base in Djibouti is?
What I think is, I actually did some research on how a Chinese strategist views overseas basing. I think this, it's really, Djibouti is really the beginning of, I think, a more extensive network. But as I said earlier, that network is going to look very different from the one that we're used to, or how the United States thinks of overseas presence and access. But I think, what's interesting about the literature is they make it very clear that what China really needs is not a partner like Djibouti that is underdeveloped, that you basically have to provide all of the financial support to your capabilities. The key to making Chinese access in the future more potent is to have much more capable allies and friends. And the example they typically hold up is Singapore. Singapore would be a great partner for China to have access to because of all of the great conditions. It's economic prowess, it's financial prowess, it's great infrastructure, it's geographical position, it's political stability and so forth. And yet here is the tension for China, is that most of the high quality friends are on the U.S. side, right? It's the fundamental asymmetric advantage that we have just talked about earlier. And so there's a real sort of barrier to Chinese entry into this particular market because most of the high quality friends in which China would love to have access to are actually currently aligned with the United States. So I think one of the things to look at is to come up with a list of those areas where we would truly be worried about if China were ever to have access to. Singapore would certainly be, on quite high on that list. And then by sort of prioritizing it in that order, it might give U.S. Decision makers a sense about where to weight their priorities. Like, we need to work on countering China's potential ability to gain access in those areas, whereas there are other areas where we probably don't need to invest as much political or diplomatic capital. It's a good way of helping to discern how we allocate scarce resources in dealing with sort of China's presence that seems to be, at the present, at least anyways, to be everywhere.
Okay, well, with that, we're going to conclude our event. Before we leave, I just want to say that if you would like to sign up for our reading series this semester, please visit the sign-in table outside. Also, we have our keyboard applications and committee positions open, so if you have any questions, please speak to some of our executive board members outside of the sign-in table. With that, on behalf of the Alexander Hamilton Society and our audience here today, thank you guys both for coming. It's been incredible.